The sun beat down hard on the New Mexico dust, mean, unrelenting, and without apology. Mabel Dunn wiped her brow with the hem of her apron, her boots crunching over dry soil as she crossed the paddock. The well had been low all week, and the pump creaked like it had arthritis in its bones. She carried 2 buckets, one for the animals, the other for herself. But it didn't go that way, because as she rounded the corner of the barn, she saw him, half hidden in the brush, slumped against a fence post. Blood at his side, dirt caked in his dark hair, bare-chested, barely breathing. Apache. Even before he opened his eyes, she knew what he was. Even before she knelt beside him, she knew what this might cost her. But she poured the water anyway. First into his cupped hands, then to his lips. He didn't thank her, didn't speak, just drank. Watched her like she was more threat than mercy. And when she turned away to fetch a cloth, he was gone. But the next day his people came, on horseback, with paint on their faces and fire in their eyes. The first thing Mabel noticed was the silence. Not the kind that came from peace or distance, but the kind that settled over the land like a held breath. The chickens hadn't stirred. The wind had died completely. Even the insects seemed to be listening to something she couldn't hear. She stood on her porch with a chipped enamel cup in her hand, the coffee inside gone cold. It didn't matter. She wasn't drinking it. She was watching the horizon. The Apache had vanished the night before. She'd found him slumped near the fence line just past sundown, a mess of blood, sweat, and dust. He hadn't spoken, just looked at her, watched as she knelt beside him, checked the wound in his side, and poured water into his cupped hands. He drank, coughed once, then vanished when she turned her back to fetch a cloth. Now the wind smelled different. Mabel set the cup on the porch rail and stepped out into the yard. She didn't have to look long. There, at the edge of her eastern field, just where the land dipped into the gulch, figures moved. 4 riders, paint on their faces, shadows cutting across them like they were carved from smoke. She didn't run, didn't go for the rifle she kept under the bed, didn't even reach for the axe by the chopping block. She just stood. The riders came slowly, not like a threat, not exactly, but not like visitors either. She recognized the posture, military in its precision, measured, designed not to provoke but to remind. We see you. We know what you did. They stopped just outside the fence, where the dry earth cracked in wide, looping patterns. Dust clung to the hooves of their horses, which shifted only slightly beneath them. One rider dismounted. Mabel felt her stomach tighten. It was him, the same Apache who had bled beside her barn the day before. No longer weak, no longer hunched. Now upright, bare-chested, with a faded red sash tied around his waist and a rawhide pouch hanging from one shoulder. He stepped forward without speaking. In his hands, he carried something wrapped in a square of cloth. She didn't breathe until he stood on the other side of the fence, his eyes locked with hers. When he unwrapped the cloth, she saw it, her canteen, the one she'd filled pressed into his hands. The leather was still wet at the seams, but the water was gone. He held it out. She crossed the yard slowly, boots crunching the loose gravel, took the canteen without hesitation. I didn't ask for it back, she said. He didn't smile, but something in his face shifted. You gave it freely. I did, he nodded. Then we returned what was not ours to keep. For a long moment, they just looked at each other. You speak English, she said. Enough. Are they here to hurt me? No. Then why are they here? Because you touched a man who was supposed to die, he said, and now his life marks your land. She blinked. I didn't mean to mark anything. No one ever does. With that, he stepped back. One of the other riders leaned forward in his saddle and said something in Apache. The man nodded, replied briefly, then turned to Mabel again. They won't return, not unless you ask. I won't. He nodded once, then walked back to his horse. In seconds, the 4 riders disappeared over the hill. Mabel was alone again, but the land didn't feel empty. It felt watched. She turned, walked back to the porch, and sat down hard on the steps. The canteen lay across her knees, cool against the backs of her hands. She didn't know what she had done, but she had changed something. and it had changed her too. That night she barely slept. The shadows in the house felt longer, like the moonlight was stretching them farther than it used to. She lit a lantern and moved through the room slowly, checking the locks she already knew were latched, drawing curtains she never used to bother with. Outside, the wind returned. It whistled through the barn slats, knocked a loose shutter against the side of the bunkhouse. She sat by the window with a blanket around her shoulders and stared into the dark. The canteen sat on the table. Every time she looked away, she found her eyes drifting back to it, as if it might change. In the morning, she went about her work, fed the chickens, tended to the pump, checked the well, which was lower than it should have been. She kept moving, because movement meant she didn't have to stop and think. But even as she dug her hands into the soil of the garden, she kept glancing up toward the ridge. No one came. Not that day, not the next. On the third morning, she found footprints by the creek bed, barefoot, deep, fresh. They led away from the house toward the woods. She followed them for a mile before they vanished into stone. He hadn't returned, but he'd come close. That afternoon, she found a carved stone at the base of her porch, the size of her palm, smooth, with a single painted line across the center. Black, sharp, deliberate. She didn't know what it meant, but she placed it on the mantel, and she didn't touch it again. It had been 4 days since they came. 4 days since the Apache riders crested the ridge and vanished into the morning haze like they were never there. 4 days since Mabel found that carved stone on her porch. She hadn't moved it. It sat there still, untouched and unspoken, like a word she didn't yet know how to pronounce. But she felt it, like weight under her ribs, like something waiting. She didn't tell anyone. There was no one to tell. Not unless she rode to the next ranch and started talking. About warriors, about silence. About a man who bled and didn't say thank you. She didn't want to hear what people would say. They'd twist it, make it shameful. Or worse, make it nothing at all. So she let the days pass quietly, until the 6th day when she heard the knock, not at the door, on the wall of the barn, 3 times, even deliberate. She was inside the main house folding sheets when it came. She froze, hands buried in linen, and listened. The knock came again. By the time she stepped out the door, he was already walking away. The Apache, Tahoma. He didn't look back. He simply walked the edge of her field like he was tracing the line between 2 worlds, hers and his. She didn't call out, just watched. That night, she set out a bowl of bread and roasted beans on the porch rail. It was gone by morning. She told herself it might have been the foxes, but she left food again the next night, and the next. Each time it disappeared. On the 4th night, the bowl came back empty, washed, and beside it, a second stone. This one uncarved, just smoothed by time, pale as a cloud. She placed it beside the first. No questions asked, no answers needed. It was nearly a week before he spoke to her again. She was hauling feed sacks toward the barn when he appeared, just standing by the fence post like he'd grown from the wood. "You walk heavy," he said. She paused. "Excuse me?" "You carry your weight in your shoulders." "I've had to," she replied. "I know." She leaned against the sack and studied him. His hair was tied back. His hands were bare. He wore no war paint today, just dust, leather, and quiet. "I take it this isn't a social call," she said. "I came to see if you were afraid." "Of what?" He looked past her, to the horizon. "Of what happens next?" She nodded once, slowly. "I'm not afraid of you, if that's what you mean." His gaze returned to hers. "No," he said. "That's not what I meant." And then he turned and walked away. That night she couldn't sleep. She lit a lantern and sat by the fire, listening to the wind slip through the eaves. She didn't know what it meant, that he came, that he asked, but she felt the truth of it in her chest, like something old waking up. She remembered a time, long ago, when she still had her husband. When laughter came easy and sleep wasn't something she had to fight for. That life was gone now, burned up in fever and war. But sometimes the ghosts of it flickered around her. And lately, one of those ghosts had a living face. The next day he came again, this time closer. He helped her mend the broken gatepost, saying nothing, just handed her nails, held the beam steady while she pounded it in place. Afterwards, she offered him water. He took it, drank, and returned the cup without a word. "You don't say much," she remarked. "I wasn't taught your language with ease." "You say enough." His eyes met hers. "So do you." By the end of that week, he'd cleared the path behind her barn. Not with her permission, not with her protest. It just, happened. Each day she found something small change. A stack of wood cut and stacked. A broken hinge replaced. A rabbit left dressed and skinned, hanging on her back porch. And she let it happen. Because something inside her didn't want it to stop. One evening, he found her in the garden, trying to pull up a stubborn root. He knelt beside her, wordless, and dug with both hands. Together they pulled it free. It came loose suddenly, the two of them falling back in tandem, breathless. And then, for the first time, he laughed. It wasn't loud, but it was real. She stared at him, stunned. "I didn't think you laughed," she said. "You never gave me a reason before." "I still haven't." He nodded. "You stayed." That night they sat on the porch together. Not close, but not far either. The stars stretched wide above them, unblinking. She handed him a piece of bread. He broke it in half, passed one back. No one spoke, but they didn't have to. Because sometimes a man doesn't need to say thank you. Sometimes he just comes back. The rain came early that morning, quiet at first, tapping gently on the tin roof like it was asking permission to fall harder. Mabel stirred beneath the quilt and listened to the sound, breathing in the scent of damp earth that drifted in through the cracked window. It was the first real rain in over a month. By the time she was up and dressed, the yard had turned to mud, and by mid-morning, he was there. Tahoma. No horse this time. No leather straps. Just his boots, soaked through, and a look on his face that told her he hadn't come for work. He stood under the awning beside her porch, dripping but calm. "Something's changed," he said. Mabel leaned against the post, arms folded. "With me?" "Number with them." He looked out toward the tree line. She followed his gaze. "They don't want me here," she said plainly. "No," he replied. "They don't understand why you gave me water, or why I stayed." "Do you?" He turned his head slowly to her. "I do now." His voice was steady, but something behind it was fraying. She narrowed her eyes. "What aren't you saying?" "There's a meeting, elders. They want answers." "From me?" "From me. About you." "And what will you tell them?" He didn't answer. Instead, he stepped back into the rain and walked toward the barn. She found him later in the loft, sitting near the open hatch, watching the water trail down the roof slats. His coat lay beside him, heavy and wet. His shoulders were bare now, marked with old scars that curved like rivers down his back. She climbed up without a word and sat beside him. For a long time, they just listened to the storm. "You ever wonder why people do things for strangers?" he asked. "All the time." "And?" "I think we do it because we see something of ourselves in them." He nodded. "You saw me?" She thought about that. "You weren't dying," she said. "Not really, but something in you had given up." "And you?" "I hadn't gotten that far yet, but I was close." Silence followed. He turned to her, his voice lower now. "They'll ask me to prove where I stand." "You mean they'll want blood?" He didn't say yes, but he didn't say no. That night the wind rose with the rain, and the two fires in Mabel's stove crackled like they were trying to speak. She sat by the kitchen table, staring at the stone he'd left her days ago. The one with the painted line across it, a divide. She traced it with her finger. The door creaked open, and he entered, soaked again. But he didn't stop in the doorway this time. He crossed the room and sat across from her. "Tomorrow," he said, "they'll call me before them." "What do you want from me?" "I want to know if you'll still see me the same way when I come back." "And if you don't?" His jaw flexed. "Then you'll have seen me once, and that'll be enough." She looked him in the eye. "Come back." It wasn't a request, it was a vow. He stood, and then, finally, he touched her hand. Not for long, but with all the meaning words couldn't carry. In the morning, he was gone. The rain had stopped, but the ground remained soft, absorbing everything. She spent the day in silence, made bread she didn't eat, repaired the hem of a shirt that no longer fit her. sat by the window and watched the edge of the trees for signs of movement that never came. When dusk fell, she lit the lantern. When night came, she didn't put it out. When the clock passed midnight, she finally stood and opened the door. And there he was, on the porch, wet, tired, alive. She didn't speak. She didn't cry. She just stepped aside and let him in. He carried no weapons, but he was carrying something, a small pouch. He placed it on her table and sat. They asked if I'd taken something that didn't belong to us. And what did you say? I said you never belonged to anyone. He opened the pouch. Inside, another stone. This one with a circle, full, unbroken. I told them I would not forget the line between us, he said, but I would not fear it either. She picked up the stone and turned it over in her hand, and for the first time in years, she felt warmth that had nothing to do with fire. I don't want to be on either side anymore, she whispered. He looked at her like he'd been waiting to hear that his whole life. Then be between, he said, with me. And in that moment, between two fires, between two lives, between two pasts that never stopped burning, Mabel finally chose something that wasn't survival. She chose not to leave. The nights grew longer after that. The air cooled more quickly once the sun dropped behind the hills, and the wind carried with it the scent of mesquite and damp stone. Mabel found herself waiting for it each evening, its brush against her face as familiar now as breath. She and Tahoma had not spoken much about what had passed between them that night, but they didn't need to. He stayed. Not every night, not in the ways that might draw judgment from the world, but in all the ways that mattered. He fixed the chicken wire, mended the splintered fence by the west field, and once, without her asking, brought her a new axe handle carved smooth from cottonwood. She cooked a little more than usual. He ate every bite, left nothing behind. Some days he came with words, others only silence, but he always came. And she began to make space. One hook by the door now held his coat, one tin cup by the sink, turned upside down like hers. A second brush left by the basin, its bristles worn from dark hair. It wasn't a declaration, it was a pattern, a life beginning to fill in the blank edges. One afternoon she found him standing by the creek that had not run since last season. His hands were at his sides, eyes narrowed like he was listening to something the ground might one day say. "What are you thinking?" she asked from behind him. He turned, not startled. "This place was water once." "I was born near the cliffs past the canyon," he said. "My father died before I could ask him his name. My mother never stopped saying it. It still will be." "No," he said. "This exact place, this dirt, it carried rivers once, before fences had names." She stepped beside him. "I don't think I was made for fences." "I know," he said, then added, "That's why I came back." She didn't speak, but she stood closer than usual. He didn't move away. That night the moon rose full and the sky went silver. They sat on the porch as coyotes howled in the far distance, and for the first time, Tahoma told her something about his youth. Mabel listened. She called him Shadow Walker, said he could disappear even when the wind stayed still. Was he a warrior? "Not always," he said, "but once." She nodded. "And you?" "I've fought," he said, "but I've also run, from more things than I'll admit." "You don't seem like a man who runs." "I ran from silence. It always followed me. Until here." She looked at him then, really looked, saw the lines around his mouth, the wear behind his eyes. "I don't think you ran here," she said. "I think you stopped." The next day a rider came from the town, not someone Mabel knew well. A merchant's son, barely more than a boy, riding with urgency and a letter in his pocket. He didn't come up the path. He waited near the outer gate and called her name until she came down herself. "I was told to give this to the widow Dunn," he said, offering the envelope. "That's me." He hesitated, glanced over his shoulder at the hills. "Folks heard there's been Apache near here." "There's been people near here," she said. He swallowed. "Well, just, be careful, ma'am." She took the letter without a word and turned away. Inside, she didn't open it. She placed it on the shelf. And that night, when Tahoma came, she handed it to him. "I think it's about you," she said. He unfolded it carefully, read it in silence. then set it down beside the fire. They want me to return, to speak, to explain. Will you? He didn't answer right away. They ask if I've lost myself. Mabel leaned forward. Have you? He looked at her like she was the only steady thing left in the world. Number, I think. I've just begun to find what wasn't allowed to grow. She reached for his hand across the space between them, held it, warm, steady. You don't need to speak for them. You don't even need to speak for me. But if you stay silent, let it be your own quiet, not theirs. He nodded slowly, and for the first time, she saw the edge of something break behind his eyes. Gratitude. Real. Deep. Wordless. The next morning, she found a bundle left at her door, wrapped in deerskin, tied with sinew. Inside, a strip of cloth marked with red dye, a mark of bond, not ownership, not belonging, but alliance, a symbol that among his people, she would not be asked to explain her choices, not anymore. She wore it that day around her wrist, tied simply. When she rode into town to buy flour, no one said anything, but they looked, some with curiosity, some with suspicion. She met every gaze with a calm that only came from knowing something was hers and no one else's to name. Even the storekeep didn't ask what it meant. He only said, "We've got fresh peaches today," and she smiled. "Then I'll take 4. She left with her head high and her horse steady. Tahoma met her halfway home, waiting by the trail with a repaired saddlebag in his hand. "You ride well," he said. "I ride better now," she replied, and they finished the journey together, side by side. That night, they didn't say much. They didn't need to, because she had come to understand something simple. Some people live their whole lives trying to be remembered by name. But the lucky ones? They are remembered by where they stayed, and who they stayed beside. The first beam went up just after dawn. Tahoma had carved it the day before. Planed smooth, measured true, cedar cured and split by hand. He drove it into the ground with a long-handled mallet while Mabel held it steady, her palms pressed flat against the grain. They didn't speak while they worked. The morning light was too gold, too fragile, and the stillness between them felt more important than conversation. It had been Tahoma's idea to build something. Not a new barn, not a house, something smaller, personal. A structure that wouldn't be used for survival, but for meaning. A place for keeping things that don't need to be seen, he'd said. She had understood, because they both had them, those quiet, invisible pieces of their lives that no one had ever asked about. Not really, and now with nothing chasing them but time, they were finally free to lay their own foundation. The frame rose slowly over the course of 3 days. No blueprints, no hammers, just handmade nails and borrowed tools, and Tahoma's memory of how things were built when words like property hadn't yet poisoned the soil. Mabel gathered stone from the creek bed. He carved signs into the lintel. Neither asked what the other was doing, but somehow it all fit. Each night they shared bread and tea by the porch. Tahoma never asked to stay. He just stayed. Sometimes on the porch bench, sometimes in the loft, once in the kitchen chair with his head resting on folded arms. And once, after a long day of lifting, sanding, hammering, they had both fallen asleep on the dirt floor of the half-finished shed, fireflies blinking between the beams like they were bearing witness to something holy. That was the night Mabel reached for his hand in the dark and didn't let go. The town didn't ask much anymore. A few riders passed by with longer glances than necessary. A child once asked Mabel if the man with the quiet voice lived at her place. She answered, "He lives where he chooses." That was enough. Still, there were those who remembered. A man at the feed store who muttered the word savage under his breath. A neighbor who stopped sending extra eggs. But Mabel didn't flinch. She had survived worse than a turn back, and the only people she needed to understand already did. On the 8th day of building, Tahoma returned from the hills with a strange expression. He carried a bundle in his hands, wrapped tightly in oilskin. "What is it?" she asked. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he brought it into the house, set it gently on the table, and unwrapped it like something sacred. Inside was a piece of wood, no longer than her forearm, carved with markings Mabel didn't recognize. Etched symbols, not letters, not English, not Apache either. At least not any she'd seen before. "It's old," he said. "Older than this land even." "Where did you find it?" "Buried, near the stones. I think someone hid it, someone who was afraid of forgetting." Mabel reached out, ran her fingers over the grooves. "Is it a name?" He nodded. "Maybe not one you can speak, but one you can feel." She looked at him. "Yours? Not just mine." "Ours." She blinked. "What do you mean?" He placed her hand flat over the wood, then his own on top of hers. "Sometimes we don't get to be remembered by name," he said, "but we can be remembered by what we built, and who we built it with." They stayed like that a long time, and for once Mabel didn't need anything explained. That night, thunder rolled low in the distance. The rain hadn't come yet, but the sky was restless, streaked with ash-colored clouds and heat that never touched the ground. Mabel stood on the edge of her porch, watching it all. Tahoma joined her, bare feet silent against the planks. "You ever think about what comes next?" she asked. He thought for a while. "I used to. And now? Now I think about what comes with." She turned to him. "What do you mean?" "I mean I've lived through enough endings. I want to learn what it means to stay through something beginning." Her throat tightened, and when the rain finally came, it was soft. Not a storm, not punishment. Just water, like forgiveness falling from the sky. In the days that followed, the structure was finished. No windows, one door, a roof that sloped low and wide. Inside, they placed no furniture, just the stone she'd kept from before, the canteen he'd returned, the carved wood with its nameless story, and a bundle of sage tied with red twine, which neither of them said anything about, but which both understood. They never named the place, but when either of them disappeared for a moment, the other knew where to look. Sometimes Tahoma would sit inside with his back to the wall and eyes closed. Sometimes Mabel would light a single candle and watch it burn all the way down. Not for ceremony, just because. Because they had made something together, something that wasn't a barn, or a grave, or a house built on anyone else's rules, just a room where a life could rest. One morning, Mabel found a piece of cloth folded on the table. Inside, a set of moccasins, worn but sturdy, just her size. And on the toe of the left shoe, stitched in a faded thread, was a symbol that matched the carved wood inside their shelter. She slipped them on without speaking and walked out to meet the day. Not as a settler, not as a widow, not even as a woman who'd offered water to a dying man, but as someone who had stayed and chosen and helped build something no wind could carry away. The fire started far from her land. It began where the brush grew thick along the north ridge, fed by wind and old timber. No one saw it coming. No lightning, no spark. Just a red bloom on the horizon one dusk, like someone had opened the sky and poured blood across the mountains. By morning, the smoke had reached her porch. Not thick, not choking, just enough to taste on the back of the tongue. Enough to remind her that some things, no matter how well tended, will come for you eventually. Mabel didn't panic. She moved slowly, methodically. She filled every barrel with water, closed the barn, untied the mule and let it loose toward the dry creek bed, farther from the trees. She didn't ask where Tahoma was. She knew he'd come, and he did. An hour after the ash began to fall, he stepped out of the heat haze, boots black with soot, a slash of dirt across his cheekbone. "You stayed," he said. "Of course I did. We may need to leave." Mabel shook her head. "Not unless the fire walks through the door." He looked at her a long time, then said, "Then let's make sure it doesn't." They soaked the porch with buckets, dug a trench around the small outbuilding they'd built together, covered it with wet cloth, with blankets, with prayer. Not spoken aloud, but breathed, steady and deep, with every motion. Neighbors had left already. Those who lived on flatter land could move their stock and wagons. She saw distant plumes of dust to the west, caravans of caution. But Mabel had long ago decided she would not run again. Tahoma didn't argue. He simply stayed. By nightfall, the glow of the fire had drawn closer. No flames yet, just the slow, relentless light of something consuming what no longer resisted. They sat on the porch, both too tired to speak, and then she said softly, I used to think this land wanted me gone. He didn't look away from the hills. It never did. No, she said. I did. I wanted me gone. He turned to her. You're not that woman anymore. She exhaled. Number, I'm not. They didn't speak again until the first ember floated across the sky. The wind changed sometime after midnight, brought the fire down lower, faster, crackling, alive. The barn caught first, a shriek of heat and old pine. Mabel didn't try to save it. She stood with her arm around Tahoma's waist and watched it go. He held her shoulder. Steady. Beside them, the outbuilding, the place they had made without a name, still stood. Blankets smoldered, smoke curled from the lintel, but it didn't catch. When the wind passed, when the fire turned and began to climb back toward the ridge, it was still there. So were they, covered in ash, eyes wide, hands clasped tight, alive. At dawn, the world was gray, sky, soil, breath. But the house had held, and so had they. They ate breakfast on the porch as if it were any other day. Toast burned, tea bitter. Mabel couldn't stop smiling. I thought I would mourn the barn, she said, but I don't. It served its time. So did that chapter of me. He looked at her. You're ready? I think I've been ready a long time, she said. I just needed to stand in something long enough to believe it wouldn't burn. She reached into her apron and withdrew the smooth stone he'd given her, the one with the full circle. It didn't burn, she whispered. No, he said. It never could. She turned it in her palm. Let's build something again. That spring, they did. A new barn, simpler, lower, and a second room added to the house where sunlight hit the floor just so in the mornings. They planted beans and sage and flowers Mabel couldn't name, but that bloomed anyway. Neighbors returned. Some brought nails, some brought words, and a few, just a few, brought respect. That was enough. Tahoma carved a new beam for the front porch, etched into it, not in English or Apache, but in the same ancient markings from the wooden tablet he'd once buried behind the outbuilding. Mabel never asked what it said. She didn't have to. She knew. One night, long after the new garden had taken root, Mabel sat with a book open in her lap and her feet bare against the cool floorboards. Tahoma sat across from her, threading arrow fletchings. They worked in silence for a long while. Then she said, Do you think they'll remember us? Who? Anyone, after we're gone. He didn't answer immediately, then looked at her with the calm certainty she'd come to love. They'll remember this place, he said. The stone, the soil, the room with no name. And that'll be enough? That's more than most. She closed the book, crossed the room, sat beside him. He pressed his forehead to hers, and she whispered, We were never meant to find each other, he replied, and yet we did. Outside, the wind carried only petals now, and somewhere in the hills, the land that had once marked her for silence had given her something better. A name it couldn't take, a place it couldn't burn, and a love that didn't need to be spoken to be real. Some stories aren't written in ink, but in silence and soot, along fence posts, across fire lines, between the steady hands of two people who chose not to run. Mabel didn't ask to be brave. She just kept showing up. Tahoma didn't ask to be understood, but he stayed long enough to be known. Together, they didn't fight the world. They rebuilt one small part of it, with stone and bread and quiet mornings where nothing needed to be said. Maybe you've stood where Mabel stood, too tired to explain yourself, too proud to leave. Maybe you've waited like Tahoma did, for someone to see past the silence and stay anyway. Or maybe you're somewhere in between, like most of us. Either way, you know this. It isn't grand gestures that make us whole. It's the everyday choice to believe we're worth coming back for. So tell us, which moment in their journey stayed with you? Was it the water, the fire, the silence between two people who didn't have to speak to be heard? We'd love to hear what this story meant to you, and where in the world you're watching from, because stories like theirs, they only stay alive when someone chooses to remember. They said no one came to Ash Hollow after dark, not unless they had ghosts riding shotgun. The wind tore through the canyon like it was angry, and the rain came down in sheets, slicing sideways against the pines. John Mercer sat in his cabin, boots off, rifle close, listening to the storm batter the roof like fists that had run out of mercy. He hadn't spoken to another soul in 3 days, hadn't needed to. Silence suited him. Ever since the accident, ever since the fire, peace came only in quiet, and even that was thin. Then came the knock, not a polite one, a knock full of weight and warning, a sound that split the night in two. When he opened the door, she was there, soaked to the bone, eyes hollow, dress clinging like it wanted to vanish. In her arms, wrapped in a torn blanket, was a baby boy with wide, unblinking eyes. Mira Calloway didn't beg. She didn't explain. She just said, "He's not yours, but he needs you." And John, who hadn't let anyone past his porch in years, did the one thing he swore he never would. He let them in. John Mercer hadn't opened his door for a stranger in over 5 years. Not since the fire. Not since the loss that left his voice quieter and his nights longer. But tonight, with the storm gnawing at the rafters and the mountain wind howling like a widow, he opened it for her. She stood soaked and still, dress once yellow, now the color of dirt, one eye swelling from a fresh bruise, her arm wrapped tight around something bundled in gray cloth. A child. John didn't move. Neither did she. "He's not yours," she said again, voice flat, southern-touched. "But he needs you." Then she turned and disappeared into the dark, as if she'd only come to deliver the storm's message. John stared into the trees. The shadows swallowed her whole. When he looked down, the child blinked up at him, quiet, waiting. He shut the door, then leaned his back against it, breath heavy. He could have left the boy there. He could have tossed a blanket over him and returned to the fire, but he didn't. John unwrapped the bundle. A baby, maybe 2 months at best, pale-skinned, eyes wide, a cut above his cheekbone half-healed. The boy didn't cry, he just watched. John's hands were calloused, made for ropes and rifles, not for children. Still, he moved slow. Found a clean towel, dipped it in warm water, wiped the boy's face. The fire popped behind them. Outside, the rain beat harder. John laid the baby near the hearth, tucked him in a wool-lined saddlebag, and whispered, more to the shadows than the boy, "Well, damn." He hadn't said that word in a long time, not out loud. He hadn't spoken to anyone since burying his brother 2 winters ago. A storm just like this had taken the horse and the man in the same hour. John was left with a barn full of debt and a name no longer spoken kindly in town. Now here was this child, asleep but not safe. By midnight, the wind began to change, curling low and bitter against the cabin walls. The fire dimmed and the baby stirred. Not with a cry, but a sort of breathless whimper, the kind that worked under the skin. John found himself humming, not a song, just tones, the kind he'd use when a colt was nervous. Soft, shapeless things that meant nothing but comfort. Eventually, the boy quieted. John sat in his chair again, rifle resting by the door. Baby curled beside the hearth. He stared at the flames until they blurred. At dawn, the storm broke. Mist clung to the earth like regret. John opened the door slowly, expecting what exactly he didn't know. Maybe the woman, maybe a note, maybe nothing. But the porch was empty, no footprints, no shadows, only the wind and the gray. John named the boy Noah. It wasn't his right, but it was something, felt right, maybe always had. He wrapped him in a clean blanket, boiled oats into a thin mush, and fed him by thumb. The child took to it, weakly but without protest. John watched him closely. Noah didn't cry much. That worried him. Children cry, he thought. That's what they do. But this one didn't. By afternoon, John hitched his mule and rode the long trail into Ash Hollow. The town was quiet. Smoke rose from chimneys. The muddy streets were streaked with cart tracks and boot prints, but no one lingered in the open. The general store was half lit. Mara, the owner, squinted when he entered with the bundle strapped to his chest. "Is that a baby?" John didn't answer. He set powdered milk, matches, and a few candles on the counter. "Yours?" "No." "Then whose?" He looked her in the eye. "Didn't ask." Mara pursed her lips but said no more. She bagged the items and handed them over without ceremony. Outside, the sheriff leaned against the post office rail. He tilted his hat back, squinting against the late sun. You take up nursing now, Mercer? Something like that. The sheriff nodded once. Folks'll talk. They always do. And with that, John rode home. Back at the cabin, he boiled water, changed the boy's swaddle, and tucked him into a drawer lined with wool and cedar shavings. It smelled like a home, or something close to it. As dusk settled, John found himself pacing. He kept glancing toward the tree line. She was out there, not vanished, just waiting. And the way Noah blinked toward the door every so often told him, the boy knew it too. John Mercer didn't sleep that night. Not really. He sat in the rocking chair by the hearth, boots on, rifle leaned against the wall, and Noah tucked into the wool-lined drawer beside the fire. The cabin creaked with every shift of wind. Outside, the woods held their breath. It was the kind of silence a man didn't trust, the kind that came before something broke loose. By dawn, the baby stirred. No crying, just a restless movement, fists curling, breath hitching like he'd dreamed of things no child should. John bent down, lifted him carefully, and held him against his chest. The boy was warm, soft, impossibly small. John couldn't remember the last time he'd held something that didn't flinch from his touch. You're too quiet, he muttered. Babies are supposed to cry. Noah blinked up at him, eyes dark and steady. There was something knowing in them, not wise, not quite, but aware, like he understood just how much was riding on his little heartbeat. After feeding him the last of the milk and oats, John stepped out into the morning. The woods around Ash Hollow were soaked through. Mist clung to the ground like memory, and the trees stood heavy with rain. He scanned the tree line without meaning to. And that's when he saw it. A strip of fabric, yellow, faded, torn, caught on a thorn bush near the ridge. He moved slow, hand on the knife at his belt. The cloth fluttered once, then stilled. No footprints in the mud, no broken branches. But someone had been there, and gone again. She hadn't left him completely. That afternoon, John chopped wood behind the cabin. Noah slept nearby in a basket padded with old quilts. The boy stirred once, let out a half whimper, then went still again. It unnerved John, that silence. A man didn't grow up around livestock and younger cousins without knowing what healthy lungs sounded like. But this child, he didn't cry unless he had to, as if he'd already learned the world didn't reward noise. John wiped sweat from his brow, splitting another log clean down the center. He didn't hear the footsteps until it was too late. She stood at the edge of the clearing, pale and thinner than he remembered, hair pulled back, one hand wrapped around her ribs. John dropped the axe but didn't move toward her. You came back. She didn't speak for a moment. Her eyes were on the baby, not him. Her breath caught. Her shoulders shook once, but she held firm. I had to see him, she said finally. Make sure he was alive, warm. You named him? John asked. She nodded. Noah. He waited. When she didn't move, he nodded toward the porch. You can come inside, for a while. Inside, the air was warmer. The fire crackled low, and Noah stirred at the sound of her voice. She crossed the room slowly, hands trembling. John noticed the fresh bruises on her arms, green and purple like rot beneath the skin. He found me, she said softly, 2 weeks ago, in Silverton. John didn't need to ask who. The answer clung to her like smoke. Maddox, she nodded. He forgave me, said I was foolish, then broke 2 of my ribs for running. John felt the rage crawl up his spine, but he kept his voice level. You shouldn't have come back. I couldn't stay gone. He studied her. Mira Calloway looked like she'd lost a war just to stand upright. But there was something in her eyes now. Clarity, maybe. Not fear, not quite strength. Just a woman who'd run out of places to run. I'm not here to beg, she said. I just needed to see him, to know someone gave a damn. John looked down at Noah, then back at her. I do, he said. She nodded once, like that was all she needed. Then I'll go. He moved before he could stop himself. Number, you'll stay, if that's what you want. I don't want to bring trouble. You already did, he said. But he's here now, and I don't send children into the dark. She blinked hard. For a long time, they stood in silence. Then she asked, You think Maddox will come? John didn't hesitate. He will. Her fingers curled at her sides. He won't stop. Number, but he can be stopped. Mira looked at him, really looked, and for the first time, something passed between them that wasn't fear or obligation or desperation. It was small, almost too small to name, but it was there. She turned toward the cradle and touched Noah's cheek. He leaned into her palm, let out a soft sound like a sigh. John said, "I reckon this cabin is yours too, at least for now." She didn't thank him. He didn't need her to. That night, they sat on opposite sides of the room, firelight between them. Mira stitched a rip in her coat. John oiled the barrel of his rifle. Outside, the wind was quiet, but in the silence, something had shifted. Not trust, not yet, but the beginning of it. 2 nights passed without a word. Mira kept mostly to herself, tending to Noah with a quiet grace that didn't ask for space but still claimed it. She moved through the cabin like someone who didn't want to leave tracks. Light-footed, careful, eyes always scanning for something that hadn't arrived yet, but surely would. John noticed it all. The way she wrapped her ribs tighter when she thought he wasn't looking. The way she stared at the baby with awe and guilt in equal measure. And the way she still flinched, sometimes, at shadows. John didn't push. Instead, he chopped wood, patched the roof, reinforced the door with an extra beam of pine. "You expecting a bear?" Mira asked once, eyebrow raised. He didn't look up. "Something worse." On the 3rd morning, the air shifted. It wasn't the wind. It was the silence. A different kind. The kind that settles over land when something's watching it. John felt it in his chest before he smelled it. Smoke. He stepped outside. Thin tendrils of gray curled into the sky from the south ridge. Not wildfire. Controlled. Small. Someone had lit a fire out there, just beyond the line of sight. He returned to the cabin, jaw tight. "You said he'd come," he told Mira. She nodded without turning. "He won't send a letter. He just shows up." Later that day, John rode into Ash Hollow. Not for supplies, just to be seen. The sheriff stood near the jailhouse, boot heels planted firm, chewing a splinter of wood. "You look like a man waiting for bad news," the sheriff said. John dismounted slowly. "Might already be here." He explained the smoke, the strange quiet, the stranger that never quite showed their face. The sheriff sighed. "You think it's Maddox?" John nodded. The sheriff scratched his beard. "Folks around here, they don't want that kind of trouble. You understand? I didn't ask for help." "Good, 'cause you won't get much." John leaned in. "If I fall, you'll wish you had." The sheriff didn't argue. He just tipped his hat low and walked back inside. When John returned home, Mira was already on the porch. She held Noah in her arms, rocking slow. Her eyes were distant. "You saw it too?" he asked. "Smoke?" She nodded. "That's him." "You sure? Men like him don't just burn wood. They burn warnings." John sat beside her. For a while, neither spoke. Then she said, "I left in the middle of the night. No shoes. Just him and a knife I didn't use." John looked at her. She didn't meet his gaze. "I ran through brambles, slept under a wagon, walked 4 days before I even thought to eat. But I kept going, because I thought, if I could just find someone who didn't look at Noah like he was a curse." John said nothing. She laughed softly, bitter and cracked. "You didn't even ask me who I was. You just opened the door." He leaned forward, elbows on knees. "Because I know what it means to be left in the rain." That night, they didn't sleep much. John checked the rifle, then the revolver, then the back door. Mira bathed Noah in warm water from the kettle. She sang under her breath, an old lullaby John didn't recognize, but it bent the shadows in the room into something softer. Outside, the firelight on the ridge disappeared, but the scent of smoke lingered, and so did the feeling that something had been marked, that the forest had blinked, and when it opened its eyes again, everything would be different. At dawn, hoofbeats sounded on the trail. John was already standing when they came into view. 3 riders, one older man, gray beard, wide hat, one wiry, toothpick-chewing kid no older than 20, and in the center, a man dressed in dust and silence. He didn't wear a badge, didn't need one. Authority clung to him like sweat. They didn't come up to the porch. They just stopped at the clearing's edge and waited. John stepped out. The man in the middle raised 2 fingers in greeting. "You John Mercer?" "I am. We heard you've been carrying something that don't belong to you." John's voice was flat. "The boy was left on my porch." The man nodded. "Name's Ruckler. I ride for someone." "Maddox." A pause. "Didn't say the name." "You didn't have to." Ruckler's horse stamped the ground. "He's looking for what's his." John crossed his arms. "He wants the child. He comes himself." "He will." John didn't blink. "Then I'll be here." When they left, Mira came outside. Her face was pale. Her arms were shaking. "You still think you can hold this place?" "I don't know," John admitted, "but I won't give him to that man." She stared at him, long and quiet, then finally said, "Then I'll stay too." Not as a favor, not as an apology, but as a line in the dirt, and a woman willing to defend it. The wind shifted sometime after midnight. It came down from the ridge, sharp and cold, carrying the kind of silence that doesn't come naturally, the kind that waits, that listens back. John Mercer was already awake. He stood by the front window, lantern turned low, shotgun resting against the sill. His eyes scanned the tree line, the place where moonlight met shadow and nothing moved. Inside, Mira wrapped Noah in 2 layers of flannel and tucked him into the crate they'd turned into a cradle. She kissed his forehead once, gently like it might be the last time, and knelt beside him, listening for every breath. John didn't speak. He didn't need to. The air had thickened. Even the fire in the hearth had gone quiet. Its crackle dulled like it sensed what was coming. Then came the sound. Boots on mud, slow, intentional. 3 men stepped into the clearing, rifles slung low, pistols easy on their hips. They didn't speak, didn't call out. They just stood at the edge of the trees, watching the cabin like wolves sizing up a wounded deer. Mira moved beside John. He handed her the second rifle without looking. "You sure about this?" he asked. "No," she whispered, "but I'm done running." The first shot came fast, shattered the lantern near the window. Glass exploded across the floor. Mira ducked, pulled the cradle tighter behind the table. Noah stirred, let out a soft cry, but didn't scream. John fired once, hit the post by the porch. A second shot echoed back. This time, it caught the edge of the roof. "They're trying to burn us out," he muttered. "No woodpile near the porch," Mira said. "You cleared it yesterday." John almost smiled. "Glad you noticed." They waited. The second wave came harder. 2 men rushed from the brush, firing wide, one circling to the left, the other toward the shed. Mira aimed low and fired, caught the leg of the one flanking left. He crumpled, howling. John ducked as a bullet slammed into the doorframe. He returned fire, once, then twice. One body dropped behind the rain barrel, lifeless. Then everything went still again. No voices, no movement, just the wind. And then, the footsteps, slower this time, heavy, measured. Maddox stepped into the clearing like a preacher walking to a pulpit. Long black coat, beard streaked with gray, rifle resting against one shoulder like it weighed nothing at all. His face didn't carry fury, it carried certainty. John stepped onto the porch. "I told your man," he said, "if you wanted something, you'd come yourself." Maddox smiled, slow and cold. "You got my son. You had a woman you beat half to death. That don't make him yours." "No," John said, "but it sure as hell makes him not yours." Maddox tilted his head. "You think you're a hero? You think you're building something righteous out here? You're just a man in a cabin playing father to someone else's sin." Inside, Mira raised her rifle again. John didn't look back. "You step 1 foot closer, I won't wait." Maddox's smile faded. He looked past John, toward the window, toward the flicker of light and shadow where Mira stood. "She ran once," he said. "She'll run again." "No," John said, voice steady. "Not this time." The silence stretched. Then Maddox stepped forward. John fired. The bullet caught him high in the shoulder, spun him back, dropped him to one knee. But he didn't fall. He just laughed. "You're slower than I thought," he growled, blood dripping from his coat. Another shot rang out, this one from inside. Mira's bullet caught the edge of his thigh. Maddox cursed and staggered, dropping his rifle. John advanced, shotgun raised. "That's two. I only need one more." Maddox looked up at him, sneering. "You won't do it. You're not like me." John's grip tightened. "Exactly." And then the final shot came. But not from John. From Mira. It was clean. Quick. Straight through the chest. Maddox gasped once, hands twitching like he didn't understand, and then collapsed into the mud. The clearing went still again. Noah whimpered inside but didn't cry. Mira lowered the rifle slowly, her hands trembling. John turned to her, breathing hard. "You didn't have to." "Yes," she said. "I did." They buried the body behind the ridge. No markers, no prayers. The two remaining men fled before dawn. One left a rifle, the other a blood trail into the trees. No one came after that. Later that morning, Mira sat on the porch, Noah asleep in her arms. Her face was pale, but her eyes were sharp, focused. John brought her a cup of coffee, then sat beside her, silent. "You think he'll remember any of this?" she asked. John shook his head. "Number, but we will." She looked down at the baby, then out at the horizon. The sky was clearing. Sunlight stretched across the hills like something earned. "I didn't come here for a life," she said quietly. "I came here because I had nowhere else." John nodded. "Now you do." Inside, the fire crackled, not with threat, but with warmth. And as the wind shifted again, it didn't carry fear this time. It carried peace, hard-earned, fragile, but real. The sky turned gold 3 mornings in a row. After everything, the land itself seemed gentler, like it too had survived something. Birds returned to the trees outside the cabin, timid at first, then bold. Even the crows on the fence post no longer cawed warnings, just presence. Inside, Noah gurgled from his spot near the hearth, wrapped in his quilt like a secret only the fire knew. John was fixing the doorframe again, this time not out of urgency, but intention. Mira stood nearby, arms crossed, watching him shape a new hinge from scrap iron. Her ribs still ached. Her sleep was uneven, but her hands didn't tremble like before. "You ever think this place might get quiet again?" she asked. John glanced at her. "No," she nodded. "Me neither." He tightened the last screw, leaned back, and admired the fit. "But I figure quiet's something we earn, not something we wait on." Mira smiled faintly. It was the kind that started in the eyes, the kind that looked like it might stick. That afternoon, Mira walked down the trail toward the edge of the stream. It wasn't far, but far enough to remember space could still be hers. She carried a blanket, a small knife, and nothing else. The forest greeted her with soft moss and the sound of running water. No footsteps, no voices, just her. By the creek, she sat on a flat stone and pulled out the old yellow scrap of cloth from her coat pocket, the one she'd torn on the thorn bush that night she first ran. She smoothed it flat over her lap, stared at it for a long while. She didn't cry. She hadn't cried since the night Maddox died. But today she did something else. She took the knife, sliced the fabric into thinner strips, and began to braid it. Slow, deliberate, like she was threading something broken back into form. When she finished, she tied the braid around her wrist. It wasn't for decoration, but for memory. A braid of every mile she didn't turn back. Back at the cabin, John was building a shelf. He didn't say what for, but Mira noticed later that night, after supper, that he'd placed 3 things on it: a small bird carving, its wings unfinished, the empty casing from the bullet that ended Maddox, and a pine cone Noah had tried to chew before Mira caught him. It was crooked, a little too narrow, but solid, like most things John Mercer touched. The next day, Mira rose early, before the baby stirred, before the kettle whistled. She stepped outside into the fog and picked up the axe from the porch. John found her an hour later, sleeves rolled, arms lined with sweat and bark. She was splitting kindling with a rhythm that matched her breathing. "You plan on taking over all my chores?" he asked, voice rough from sleep. She didn't stop. "Just figured it was time I stopped acting like a guest." He stepped beside her, reached for a log, and set it in place. She raised the axe and brought it down with precision. "I never thought of you as a guest." "No," she said, wiping her brow. "What then?" John looked at her, the sunrise behind her lighting the edges of her face. Maybe someone the house was waiting for. She said nothing, but her eyes shimmered. That evening the sheriff rode out, not in uniform, no guns drawn, just him and a saddlebag of supplies, flour, soap, coffee. He stood awkwardly at the edge of the porch, hat in hand. "Town's quiet again," John nodded. "Glad to hear it. Folks ain't talking about Maddox much. Some say he rode south. Others say he was never here." Mira stepped onto the porch. The sheriff tipped his head. "I ain't here to stir anything," he said, "but I figured you ought to know. There's talk of folks up north looking for a wet nurse, or a midwife, or both." Mira raised a brow. "That's some kind of invitation?" "No, ma'am," he said quickly. "Just word travels, and yours is turning into the kind folks remember for the right reasons." She crossed her arms. "We're not looking to leave." "I didn't figure," he said. Then he nodded to the baby in Mira's arms. "Name?" "Noah," she said. "Good name." The sheriff cleared his throat. "You let me know if you need anything." "We've got enough," John replied. The sheriff nodded again, climbed onto his horse and rode off into the mist. That night, as the last of the fire turned to ember, John took a seat by the window, cradling a mug of coffee gone cold. Mira sat on the floor near Noah's cradle, threading a strip of calico into a small soft doll. "I keep waiting for the world to remind me this is temporary," she said. John looked over. "And? It hasn't." He set down the mug, walked over, sat beside her. Noah shifted in his sleep, murmured something that sounded almost like a word. John reached over, touched the edge of the cradle. "You think he'll remember any of this?" Mira shook her head. "Number, but maybe he'll feel it, like something warm that stayed with him even when everything else was cold." John looked at her. "You could still leave." "I know. You could go find a town where no one knows your name." She nodded. "But here, I'm writing a new one." John smiled. It wasn't wide, it wasn't easy, but it was real. Outside, the frost returned, but inside something was blooming. Not fast, not loud, but sure. By the time the first thaw reached Ash Hollow, Mira had stopped checking the door every night. The snow didn't melt all at once. It lingered like a secret. But each morning brought a little more earth back. The cabin's steps creaked with wetness. The trees dripped like they were letting go of something. John sat on the porch most evenings now, mending tools or just listening. Mira had taken to planting herbs in chipped teacups by the windowsill. Rosemary, thyme, even wild mint she found near the stream. "For later," she said once. "For staying." Noah had started to giggle. Not often, but when he did, it was like sunlight on water. Fleeting, quiet, but impossible to ignore. One afternoon, Mira carried a load of kindling in her arms, cheeks flushed from the cold. She paused at the fence line where John was setting new posts. "You ever think about what's next?" she asked. John wiped his brow with the back of his sleeve. "Used to, before. And now?" He leaned on the post, eyes on her. "Now's enough." She nodded. "That's what I keep telling myself. But part of me still thinks we're in the middle of something. Like a story that hasn't decided if it ends in peace or in fire." He smiled gently. "Maybe that's not our job to decide. Maybe all we're meant to do is show up." Mira looked down at the frost-bitten earth beneath her boots. "I showed up running," she said. "You opened the door anyway." John didn't answer. He didn't need to. That night, Mira lit the lantern while John read by the fire. Noah slept in his cradle, feet kicking against the quilt, even in dreams. Mira stood by the window, watching the reflection of firelight in the glass. "He'll grow up," she whispered, "and we'll have to tell him." "Tell him what?" "That he was born of fear," she said, "that he was chased into this world." John looked at her. His voice was quiet, steady. "Then we tell him that love found him anyway." She turned, eyes glassy. "And that it stayed," he added. Weeks passed. The town grew used to the three of them. Mira made trades at the general store, always polite, always measured. John worked odd jobs, mending fences, sharpening tools. When asked about the child, he simply said, "Ours." No one argued. Even the sheriff stopped asking questions. He simply tipped his hat when they passed. One afternoon, a parcel arrived. No return address, just a worn package wrapped in oilcloth. Inside, a letter written in slanted, almost trembling hand. If you're reading this, I never made it north. But I prayed you did. That boy deserves more than the road could ever give. You keep him safe. You keep him good. C. Mira didn't say who C was. She just folded the letter, pressed it into a drawer, and closed it softly. Then she kissed Noah's forehead. Spring arrived like a secret forgiven. The cabin breathed differently now. The floor no longer creaked with ghosts. The walls smelled of smoke and time. John built a new table. Mira planted lilacs along the fence. They never spoke of Maddox again, not because they'd forgotten, but because they'd finally learned to live beyond him. On the last day of April, Noah stood for the first time. He wobbled on unsure legs, looked around, and then reached for Mira's hand. When he found it, he didn't smile. He steadied. Mira knelt beside him. "You're not what he made," she whispered. "You're what we chose." John stood at the doorway, leaning against the frame, arms folded. He watched the scene like a man watching a future he didn't dare imagine until now. And when Mira looked up at him, he nodded once, as if to say, "We made it." That night, after the fire had burned low, Mira and John sat outside wrapped in wool blankets, their shoulders nearly touching. The moon hung high, silver over the hills. The trees no longer swayed in warning. They stood like witnesses, silent, still, safe. Mira looked up at the stars. "You think people like us deserve peace?" John stared at the sky with her. "We clawed our way here," he said. "That counts more than deserving." She smiled, not the broken kind, but the kind that stays, and somewhere in the dark. A cradle rocked gently. A wind passed through the trees, not with teeth or thunder, but with something gentler, like the breath of a story that knew when to rest, like a promise whispered between survivors, like the sound of home. Some stories don't begin with love. They begin with loss, and a knock on a door that was never supposed to open. But sometimes, the strongest families are the ones we choose. The quietest heroes are the ones who stay. And the most powerful word is not goodbye, but stay. If this story meant something to you, tell us in the comments. What moment stayed with you the most? And where in the world are you watching from? We love hearing how far these stories travel and who they find along the way. Maybe this tale ends here, or maybe it's just the beginning. Tap like, share with someone who believes in second chances, and subscribe for more stories that linger like firelight. We'll be waiting on the porch.